Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online developmental psychology course. And I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in psychology. This week, we're going to look at the family. So let's jump into it. The family as a system within systems. It's difficult to define family across all cultures and historical periods. The proponents of family systems theory conceptualize family as a system. It's dynamic, that is, it is a self-organizing system that adapts itself to changes in its members and to changes in its environment. Embedded in and interacts with larger social systems such as neighborhoods, communities, economies, politics in the historical era. So this is kind of just like a kind of a Bronfenbrenner kind of schematic, but a little different. Where people put particular environmental factors varies, but kind of just the general idea, and kind of consistent with this class is that development is affected by environmental factors, not just in the immediate vicinity, but or proximity to a child or just a family in this case, but also kind of these larger structures, historical periods, politics, communities, economic policies, etc. Even a nuclear family is complex, however. Mother-infant, father-infant, husband-wife, every individual and every relationship within the family affects each other individual and relationships through reciprocal influences. Adding a sibling adds a new sibling subsystem. An extended family household. Parents and children live with other kin, common across cultures. So, kind of as I stated, it's very difficult to have one definition of what a family is. And you can understand this not just in the United States, but also cross-culturally, with extended family living within either in the very close to quote-unquote nuclear family, or kind of living within that same household and having kind of just a different definition of nuclear family. For example, we reviewed some studies or some cultures in previous chapters that discuss that some children are very close to their mother, very close proximity as an early childhood, but other children spend most of their time with other children or kind of groups of community caregivers. But even beyond that, as stated, the family unit is very complex, with each individual within the family having their own kind of relationships with each other, and these relationships also impacting the larger family unit. So not just kind of those one-on-one relationships, but also kind of the overall, hashtag vibes within the house, and kind of the prospects of development within that household. Duval's family life cycle, sequence of changes in family composition, roles, relationships, and developmental tasks from the time people marry until they die. There are 8 stages. Each stage has a particular set of family members, and distinctive developmental tasks are embedded within each stage. Many people do not experience Duval's traditional family life cycle, so kind of this is a classic theory within kind of a weird context. And you can see here, on the right-hand side, that at each stage there are different roles available to an individual, and then you kind of just you work through this in a stage-like process, just like any other stage theory. But obviously, many people do not experience this traditional family lifestyle, or quote-unquote traditional lifestyle. It's just kind of traditional extends to the last 100 years or so. But I mean, regardless, many people, even in the kind of more contemporary era, do not reach all these stages. And in this era, there are more single adults. Never married is up to 28%. There are more postponed marriages. In 1960, age 20 for women, 23 for men. In 2011, age 26 for women and 29 for men. That's the average age in which individuals get married. More unmarried parents, 41% of births in 2010 were to unmarried women, and fewer children and more multi-generational families living in the same household. And I went and grabbed some additional polling from Pew. They collect this data I mean, if not yearly, but every couple of years, but probably yearly. And this is from 2019, so a little more recent sample, but you can see the trend even from 2011 or 2010 for more unmarried parents. And kind of birth overall, kind of still going through a decline with individuals in their 20s delaying marriage and having kids at later, or not having kids at all. So you can see kind of this historical shift going on in kind of contrast to that classic Duval model, where kind of the classic stage model, where once you hit a certain age, then you reach a certain role. But we see a shift in the dynamics of the family household in this 21st century. And not just that, but there are more children living in poverty in 2020 than previous years. There are more years without children, which I mentioned, years of before an individual having their first child, and there are fewer caregivers of aging adults. So kind of again, we see these big, large shifts reflecting kind of the historical era, the political and economic kind of systems that we live in the 21st century, wherein poverty increasing, and then pandemic specifically increasing poverty. We've seen life expectancy decrease for 2 years in a row in the United States, which is already adding to a larger trend of kind of life decline, really for the last, I think, approximately 4 or 5 years of stagnant or declining life expectancy within particular subgroups, but I believe even now it's kind of just an overall decrease in lifespan. And these collection of kind of shifts and development of family dynamics, of increased poverty and higher, more years, or being at a higher age before, or being older before getting married or having a child, it could be related to numerous things. Children being born in the kind of, or graduating from high school during the Great Recession, from whatever it was, beginning in approximately 2007-ish, and then continuing on. And obviously with pandemic, with individuals coming back home due to declines in the economy, and kind of also just kind of a larger trend where in the last 50 years, kind of income and wealth have really stagnated, thus kind of putting financial constraints on individuals. And not only that, but kind of, as we talked about in previous chapters, kind of a decline in social relationships. Thus, kind of that overall decline could be contributing to a sense of isolation, but also just kind of like less opportunities to socialize. So you kind of see these large shifts in the last 50 years, alongside these pandemic environmental factors, as well as kind of recession, and then from the late 2000s to kind of the recession due to the pandemic as well. And also alongside these other trends of kind of less socialization or less community involvement in the United States, impacting the dynamics of the family. So kind of going back to that dynamic system theory of family, where in all these factors kind of interacting with each other to create change and shift dynamics of the family. Mothers and fathers. Researchers repeatedly find that fathers and mothers are similar in caring for infants. They're able to feed their babies effectively and provide sensitive parenting. And fathers also become objects of attachment and serve as secure bases. Mothers spend more time directly caring for infants, but there are a few differences between mothers and fathers in how they interact with their children. Fathers play more, mothers provide more direct care. So especially the old literature, but even now really, there's always been emphasis on the mother, and really not on extended family or other caregivers, or the father as well. But kind of research has found, not, I guess arguably, but really not unexpectedly, that obviously fathers play a role in kind of development and serves as objects of attachment, but also other caregivers as well, depending on your culture and kind of the dynamics of your household. And I wanted to add some other kind of interesting historical trends in parental roles. So kind of working our way left to right, kind of on the left side here, you see the rise in dual income families. So kind of that idea of a single income earner within a traditional, again, more traditional, but kind of the cliche American traditional nuclear family, wherein the mother stays home, has become less and less common. And you can see this shift in beginning in the, kind of a big spike of this in the 1970s, wherein dual income households become the norm, increasing by almost 20% within the last 45 years. And kind of, as I was saying before, that kind of is reflected or a consequence of just kind of income stagnation, wealth stagnation. So you have kind of stagnation and those kind of income earnings. Obviously, there's still bills to be paid. Therefore, you need a second homeowner, and this is kind of, a second income earner, to kind of offset that. And this is kind of the same time as broader shift going on in the economy and politics for the last 60 years, where we really see these kind of shifts and the impact of kind of deindustrialization and kind of changing dynamics within the economy being reflected in the family household units. We also see shifts in the different shifts in the roles of parents, with obviously mothers still being higher on the overall, but kind of a shift, about a decline of 10% during the last whatever that is, approximately 30 years, and then a shift about 20% higher for fathers. But overall, obviously, looking at the chart, women still this trend towards a flattening of responsibilities for kind of caregiving within the house, but also kind of just more overall time for both fathers and mothers of working, taking care of the child, and doing housework. Mother-child and father-child relationships cannot be understood without considering the spouse. There are indirect effects. Mothers who have a close, supportive relationship with husbands tend to interact more patiently and sensitively with their babies. Fathers who have just had a pleasant conversations with their wives are more supportive and engaged when they interact with their children. When parents compete rather than cooperate, their infants may show signs of insecure attachment, or may become securely attached to one parent, but be blocked from enjoying close relationships with the other. So kind of just what we've already talked about, that that there are individual relationships within the household, but however, these relationships, as we talked about, is not just impacted by these macro factors, but really but also impacted by other relationships within the household. So in the case of a mother and father, their relationships, the way they interact with each other, has an indirect effect on their relationships with their children. So mothers and fathers who have close supportive relationships, pleasant conversations with each other, having kind of higher likelihood of being more patient and engaging and supportive of their child. So kind of it's called an indirect effect. So the dynamics, you can kind of imagine a straight line with mothers on one side of the line and their son on the other side of the line. Instead of having that direct relationship, what's in the middle of that line would be kind of like father. So it's kind of like their the dynamics of mother and son being indirectly, that kind of relationships taking kind of an indirect route, wherein, as stated, the relationships between the mother and father impacting the relationship between the mother and son. But obviously, this is way more complicated than that, because there are numerous other relationships and kind of social dynamics going on within their lives. But that's kind of the idea here. There are two dimensions of parenting: parental acceptance responsiveness, extent to which parents are warm, supportive, sensitive to their children's needs, and willing to provide affection and praise when their children meet expectations. Affectionate, smile, praise, consider a child's perspectives, but also let child know when they misbehave. Demandingness, control, permissiveness, restrictiveness is another name for that. How much control over decisions lies with the parent as opposed to with the child. Set rules, expect children to follow them, monitor children closely to ensure rule compliance. So kind of as stated, there are two dimensions of parenting style where you can be high on one of these dimensions and low on the other, or vice versa. Theoretically, low on both of these, for example. So we kind of have these two theoretically independent, but they interact. But kind of just the idea here: two different dimensions that impact parenting styles. Now let's walk through these four different classic parenting styles. Authoritarian parenting, that is a restricted parenting style combining high demandedness, control, and low acceptance responsiveness. So kind of going back to those two dynamics, or dimensions, I should say. Parents impose many rules, expect strict obedience, rarely explain why the child should comply with rules, or rely on power assertion tactics. Authoritative parenting, flexible, demanding, and exert control, sensitive to their children. They set clear rules and consistently enforce them, but have rationale for rules, explain them, and responsive to children's needs/points of view. So authoritarian, pretty straightforward. Do this thing because I said, do this thing because I'll beat your ass if you don't do it. Authoritative is kind of like the classic idea that that's associated with kind of the thought to be like the best outcomes or child developmental outcomes. Just the idea of you're being flexible, you set clear rules, but you kind of explain the rules. You have rationale, you explain them, and you're also responsive to your kind of child's points of view and needs. So it's kind of more of an interactive approach, but with still kind of firm rules. Permissive parenting, also known as indulgent parenting. High in acceptance, responsiveness, but low in demandingness, control. They're child-centered, there are relatively few rules, and make relatively few demands. Rarely exert control over a child's behaviors. Encourage children to express impulses. Neglectful parenting, also known as disengaged/uninvolved parenting. They're low demandingness, control, and low acceptance, responsiveness. Hostile and rejecting or indifferent, overwhelmed by their own problems, cannot devote energy to expressing love or enforcing rules. So kind of permissive kind of it is what its name says. It's very permissive. It's high in acceptedness and kind of low in demands, versus neglectful, where you kind of have low in everything. You're low in demanding, you're low in acceptance responsive, you're kind of just existing. Often these parents, as stated, are kind of overwhelmed with numerous other issues going on in their lives, and also had difficult upbringing as well. Outcomes traditionally associated with parenting styles. Children of permissive parents often are impulsive, aggressive, self-centered, aimless, and low independence, had little opportunity to learn self-reliance, and lack confidence in their own decision-making skills. The worst developmental outcomes are associated with neglectful, uninvolved parenting. Aggressive, frequent temper tantrums tend to be antisocial adolescents, prone to be resentful and strike back at their uncaring parents and other authority figures. The effectiveness of different parenting approaches can differ depending on the cultural and subcultural contexts in which they are used. It depends on how common a parenting style is in the culture or subculture, and whether the child views it as normal or acceptable. So we've talked about this in the previous chapter, where in different cultures have different parenting styles that are most common and are kind of associated with different outcomes than what are found in the United States. And in fact, some cultures have parenting styles. Do not even have all four parenting styles, I should say, found within their culture. But kind of this is kind of the listed here is kind of the traditional thought outcomes, and some of them are straightforward given in this context. And this is again kind of a conventional understanding of these developmental outcomes. There are differences even within the United States, obviously different subcultures that can impact these developmental outcomes. You can imagine living in a very poor neighborhood, or maybe some violent neighborhood, or something, just an unstable neighborhood kind of in general, wherein parents may need to be more authoritarian, and that kind of authoritarian parenting style acting as a protective factor against dangers outside in their neighborhood, or kind of their wherever peer interactions found within that neighborhood. But kind of just in general, and kind of like the classic, these are kind of the classic findings here. And then kind of intuitive based on, kind of classic understandings, wherein permissive individuals, because they are just constantly have a very high acceptance responsiveness, but very low in demand. Children really don't learn self-reliance and can't really make their own decision-making skills because they're always asking their parent to do it for them. But kind of just in general, kind of uninvolved parenting, we know across cultures that not necessarily from mother and father, but just neglect as a general. So that can be father, mother, an extended family, whatever the dynamics of that child caregiving culture. When that is absent, that has severe negative outcomes associated, or long-term severe negative, typically thought to be lifelong developmental outcomes, because they aren't kind of receiving really much of anything, how to interact within their given culture. They're not receiving any scaffolding. So regardless, so whatever the cultural practices are, they're not kind of receiving education or kind of understanding how to navigate the world at all because of this neglect or kind of just uninvolvement. Class, economic hardship, and parenting. Wealthy families have accumulated more wealth, while other families have seen little improvements in their finances or have lost what little they had as a result of unemployment, housing foreclosures, and eviction over the last approximately 50 years. Parents dealing with poverty and economic hardship tend to be inconsistent and sometimes harsh in parenting, and poverty disproportionately affects children under 6, female-headed household, and minority children. So kind of what we've already talked about, that these kind of macro trends impacting parenting styles and child developmental outcomes, wherein obviously parents in poverty having to deal with maybe kind of dangerous neighborhoods or kind of harsh or kind of contentious household dynamics, but also kind of just like less likely to work at a job that you care about. So you kind of just feel like shit all day working at a low-wage job, doing something you don't want to do, and just kind of that accumulation that we've talked about before of kind of these environmental stressors having an impact on parenting. And then obviously poverty disproportionately affecting particular subclasses of individuals more than others, and especially minority children, female-headed household, and children under 6. So as that has happened the last 50 years, we're kind of seeing a increase in wealth for upper income households, and you can kind of see this in chart. And this is kind of getting back to these larger trends that I've been talking about, and how these larger trends impact parenting styles, or just kind of parenting, or just family dynamics and development, more broadly speaking. And that's kind of why it's important to kind of consider these larger adjustments or kind of solutions that can help address some of these environmental stressors and address these dynamics. Or don't, and then just keep kind of those dynamics going. But regardless of whatever that decision is at the political or economic level, those decisions have an impact on development. And for this chapter, household and family dynamics. Financial stress. The family stress model centers on the negative effects of financial stresses on parental, mental health, parenting, and child development. Parents who experience financial problems feel economic pressure, tends to make them depressed, increases conflict within the family, disrupts each parent's ability to be an effective parent. Both parent and child experience stress as they cope with an environment which is polluted, noisy, and crowded. Social environments are often unstable and violent. So kind of, as we already talked about, these accumulation of stressors impacting the parents' mental health, their own development, their own state, their psychological state, and which obviously is going to impact other social dynamics within the household, but also their child's development, because it affects their parenting, how they interact with each other, and their own stress level. And we have numerous studies indicating that kind of depression and kind of this extreme stress has a negative impact on parenting. Resource investment. Lower class parents have fewer resources to invest in their children's development than higher class parents. Wealthier parents can invest more money and time in getting a child a good education, providing learning materials in the home, taking them to educational events, have more time to devote to interacting with children, spend more on nutrition, childcare, and healthcare. So it's kind of just not that you have money or whatever, and that's just magically happens, and you're magically a better parent, but rather those financial resources also open up social resources, wherein you can buy the best childcare, you can provide the best nutrition, have access to exceptional healthcare, but also just having books and just kind of interactive educational materials in the household. And not only that, but because you have that kind of safety cushion of wealth or higher wealth than lower class families, you have just more free time to spend with the child and kind of interact with them and to kind of ensure their optimal development, provide that optimal scaffolding. But also maybe not be at the same or be at lower levels of risk for certain physical illnesses or mental health, negative mental health outcomes, which may affect again your parenting, which can contribute to poor or negative developmental outcomes for offspring. And just mentioning nutrition really quickly, studies show that SNAP benefits, which in the day when I had them, food stamps, which is kind of just free food, but also kind of free food and or reduced lunches within elementary schools or just middle schools or high schools, contributing to educational outcomes. And I give kind of an example of the importance of public policy on child developmental outcomes. Cultural values and socialization goals. Poor parents have more worries about their children's welfare than wealthier parents do. They are more likely to be victims of violence, become teen parents, or come into contact with the police. Higher class parents may reason more with their children and foster initiative and creativity because there are attributes that count for business executives, professionals, and other white-collar jobs. Lower class parents may emphasize the obedience to authority figures in part because it's what is required in jobs like their own. So kind of the idea here is and you can see in this chart here that the lower your family income, the more higher levels of concern expressed by their parents for bullying, kidnapping, getting shot, getting pregnant, etc. So kind of the idea is that there's more worries, and this parents' understanding of these environmental factors that are dangerous, some more so than others, impacting the way that they parent. And it's not just kind of these immediate neighborhood dynamics of violence, but also the idea that, okay, well, realistically, what is your opportunity to kind of do that classic kind of Western understanding of what happiness is, chase your dreams, do this, have max individual autonomy to kind of achieve your internal goals. So it might not be necessarily adaptable given these realities, with having theoretically no prospect of change. So given the reality that you're not going to be able to leave this neighborhood or really make it that far geographically away, given that there's not much industry here, given that educational opportunities are limited, it's not really arguably that adaptable to be and foster kind of this initiative and creativity, because the jobs that are available are lower wage jobs that require and don't ask for and kind of de-incentivize creativity and kind of initiative. Therefore, kind of fostering those kind of traits, those abilities, can contribute to being fired from your job or something like that, and thus losing your only source of income, and therefore it's kind of not adaptive given that environmental context. So kind of you can see in the context of unchanging kind of poverty or just kind of instability within a neighborhood or household or a country, that kind of impacts your belief that these kind of larger structures that are really beyond the control of that household, but even really the immediate neighborhood, being able to change, and thus what you do is you just kind of adapt to your neighborhood and kind of just do the best you can given the kind of environment that you are developing in, that you have to live in, and thus cultural views will differ depending on kind of the environment that you are developing in. And then you can combine this with kind of like trends of isolation and less community engagement, and then the kind of the prospects of change and kind of working as community or any kind of form of collective power. The idea of that this stagnation and nothing can change kind of increases obviously, and then it's what's the point? The most of that the strategy is therefore kind of just grinning and bearing kind of thing. Poverty is associated with child health problems, emotional/behavioral problems, and academic failures. Chronic stress alters the children's stress response systems in ways that pave the way for future health and behavioral responses, also negatively impacts brain regions associated with self-regulation and coping. The worst effects of poverty are when they are experienced early in life and last for many years. So kind of just like all stressors that we've talked about, these early onset stressors, but not just kind of like when it happens, but this kind of chronic stressor, that accumulation of stress over time being associated with the worst developmental outcomes. And we see this at a physiological level, wherein chronic stress altering the children's stress response systems. We talked about the HPA axis before, the hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal gland index, or axis, I should say, which is basically just kind of a common physiological process wherein stress hormones are released in response to stress, and basically chronic stress, and in this case poverty, impacting the stress response system, wherein you become more stressed or sometimes even less stress, over time you stay not just kind of that initial bump of stress, but kind of maybe elongated stress. It's kind of unable to return to a unstressed baseline. But interestingly, there's actually other effect wherein you're not stressed at all towards anything. So that's kind of really like this numbness that you feel, which kind of decreases the ability of a child to engage with something and kind of receive parenting, important scaffolding, or it decreases their ability to benefit fully from kind of scaffolding, because you need some stress, because you need some engagement with your parent or kind of the environment. But when you're just like numb, you really have less of an opportunity to kind of engage with your parent in healthy ways. So you kind of have two different dynamics of how chronic stress can impact the physiological stress response system. Historical cross-cultural findings of poverty, and this is from actually a book called The Body Economic, and I just wanted to throw this in here. And the two charts to your right, you can see that recession leads to increases in suicide, and trends in suicide rates with the New Deal began seeing that big dip. So kind of this is again kind of reflected that these large public policies, in this case the New Deal, following the Great Recession, decreasing the rates of suicide, and then we see that recession contributing to increases in suicide in the United States. But also in the far left, we see a poll on reporting or self-reported responses to. So kind of responses to do you feel happy? I'm feeling not too happy. And we see increases for Black Americans, and we see increases for white Americans overall. But look at the difference here. We see that whites between 40 and 59 without a bachelor's degree increasing, while whites without a bachelor's degree really remaining stagnant. So we're seeing kind of differences in the fallout of kind of shifts in kind of economics and politics the last 50 years, wherein individuals without bachelor's degrees kind of reporting higher rates of unhappiness, and then also in Black individuals within the same age bracket, that 40 to 59 age range. And we actually talked about this way back in chapter 5, but kind of the idea here is deaths as despair, wherein you see life expectancy stagnating or declining within this bracket of individuals between 40 and 59. For individuals without a bachelor's degree, with kind of the theoretical idea here is that these individuals kind of just being left behind, these kind of the chief victims of or most direct victims, I should say, of kind of deindustrialization and kind of the restructuring of the economy the last 50 years. And really, these are kind of a large correlation between these groups and opioid um, deaths in the United States that we've seen really the last like 10 years, or the increase, I should say. So kind of again, just kind of the impact of historical trends on development and kind of these larger factors, environmental factors impacting developmental outcomes. Now let's talk about different models of influence in the family. The parent effects model family argues that influence is run one way, from parents, particularly mother, to the child. And the child effects model family influence argument highlights the influence of children on their parents. Young toddlers elicit sensitive care, whereas older infants who are asserting their wills force parents to set limits. Parents typically become less restrictive as their children mature and gradually, with parental guidance, become capable of making their own decisions. In response to development, parents shift from parent regulation of the child to co-regulation to self-regulation. So kind of we have two different models here. The parent model, it's this influence runs one way versus from parent to child, versus kind of the flipped version of that, the child effects model. One kind of shifts in children's development, kind of eliciting responses by the parents, wherein as a child develops, they are less dictated by their actions are less dictated by their parents kind of setting the boundaries. So you're going from like kind of the parents telling the child exactly what to do to kind of like co-decision making to kind of like independent decision making. So again, kind of the point here is just the child is driving it versus the parent is driving it. Next, we have the interactional model. It recognizes that parents' and child characteristics may combine in certain ways to influence development. It focuses on what characteristics children and parents bring to their interactions. So gene-environmental interaction is one example. Aggressive behavior is most likely to develop if a child has a variant of the MAO-A gene associated with temper control problems and is raised by an abusive parent. Takes the combination of an at-risk child and abusive environment. So kind of the idea here is that the children and parents have kind of internal characteristics that they're bringing to the table, and these two characteristics are kind of interacting, and it's kind of easiest to be understood by these gene environmental interactions, wherein a child may have a predisposition to aggressive behavior due to whatever this gene, being raised by a parent who is abusive, and kind of that combination of an at-risk child in an abusive environment contributing to a child's that gene being expressed, that gene that is kind of predisposes an individual to aggression being expressed through that environment of abuse. So kind of this idea of gene-environmental interaction. So the environment affecting the genetic expression of the child through this interactional model. Next, we have the transactional model of family influence. Parent and child are seen as influencing one another reciprocally over time. Child problems may develop when the relationship between parent and child somehow goes bad as they interact. Escalating coercive cycles of influence develops. When a destructive family process evolves, it becomes difficult to say who is more influential, parent or child. Changing a child's problem behavior requires focusing on both parents and the child. So kind of the idea here is just that over time and kind of constantly, children and parents are influencing one another, and this is kind of a reciprocal process. And because of this constant reciprocal process, if a negative, coercive kind of action happens, this can lead to kind of this cascading coercive cycle wherein both parents and children are kind of escalating this coercive cycle, kind of contributing to negative developmental outcomes for both the parent and the child. And once we're kind of in this cascade cycle, it's difficult to say who is more influential, the child or the parents. And kind of to address this, you have to change not just the parents' behaviors, but also the child's behaviors. Sibling relationships. The arrival of a sibling temporarily decreases children's affection for and responsive to their mothers. Entry of a new family mother perturbs the family system. Most firstborns take interest in and adapt well to a new sibling, while a minority have difficulty coping temporarily. Adjust to a new sibling is easier if the parent's relationship is good and remains good after the birth of a new sibling. The firstborn has a secure relationship with both parents, and both parents have good mental health and confidence in their parenting. So kind of the idea here is that kind of like all of development, this new sibling is not entering into this world in a vacuum. There's already family dynamics that's happen before the birth of this child, and those family dynamics impact the kind of adjustment of the firstborn child to a new sibling, wherein kind of secure relationships with their between the firstborn and the parents, and parents' mental health, and kind of their confidence in their parenting, contributing to the adjustment of a child to their newborn sibling. But kind of in general, most firstborns adapt well to the arrival of new siblings. Jumping ahead to siblings' influences on development, there are 4 functions of siblings. The first, emotional support. Siblings confide in one another, often more than to their parents, and they protect one another in tough times. Caregiving. In a study of 186 societies, older children were principal caregivers for toddlers in 5% of cultures. Teaching. Other siblings feel responsibility to teach, and younger siblings seek their guidance. And social experience. Having siblings to interact with can have positive effects on a child's social cognitive skills and social competence. And this can express itself through indirect effects, wherein older competent siblings contribute to caregivers' positive psychological functioning, which contributes to supportive parenting, which contributes to competent younger sibling. A negative older sibling can set in motion a negative chain of influence in the family system, leading to losses in supportive parenting and less positive outcomes for the younger siblings. So kind of as stated, we have these 4 functions of sibling development, or impacts on development, I should say. Beginning with emotional support, so really this kind of a protective factor wherein siblings confide in each other and depend on each other during tough times, especially, this can include just tough times within the family as a whole, or maybe kind of rocky relationships with their parents. And we see that older siblings feel the responsibility to teach their younger siblings, and younger siblings recognize their older siblings as a source of information and guidance that they can learn from. And we see that 5% of societies across a study of 186 societies found that older children were principal caregivers for toddlers. So that's a pretty large number. About 10 societies where older children are principal caregivers. But even beyond that, the number is much larger when the older children are not principal caregivers, but still a caregiver within their lives. And you see this in most of kind of non-Western context, but even many cultures within Western context, wherein the older child contributes to the caregiving responsibilities of the household for their younger sibling. And because of that, even in households where that's a little less common, in kind of United States, for example, or kind of like traditional households in the United States, classic weird studies kind of thing, they still have impact. These older siblings still have impacts on their younger siblings' development. wherein a negative older sibling, kind of if they hypothetically reacted incredibly negatively to the arrival of a new sibling, impacting their caregiving, wherein they're going to negatively interact with their sibling, but also contribute to less supportive parenting, which will be potentially more consequential to that younger sibling who is still in the early stages of development and still kind of depending on their parent at a much more higher and direct and constant level, because they're an infant, they're a toddler. Ripples in the parent-child relationship during adolescence. Most parent-child relationships are close. It's rare for parent-child relationships to suddenly turn bad. Troubled parent-adolescent relationships has grown out of a troubled parent-child relationships. Conflict increases temporarily during puberty, but is mainly about minor matters such as homework, chores, and disobedience. Adolescents spend more time with their peers. So kind of this idea that the classic idea that adolescents are just very troublemakers and arguing with their parents constantly is really typically not found in the most poorly functioning parent-adolescent relationships are typically those relationships who were already poor or had poor dynamics as before that child became an adolescent. That is, poor, troubled parent-child relationships contributing to or placing both of them at very high risk of having a troubled parent-adolescent relationship. Achieving autonomy. A key developmental task during adolescence is achieving autonomy. Parents give up some of their power, adolescents assume more control of their lives, and the parent-child relationship becomes more equal. How much autonomy adolescents want and how much parents grant differ across cultures. Authoritative parenting style gives adolescents opportunity to strengthen their independent decision-making skills while retaining the benefit of their parents' guidance. Authoritarian and more permissive styles produce acceptable outcomes in some cultures. So kind of this is the idea that once you hit an adolescent, you're trying to seek out autonomy, kind of have an individual identity that wants to be expressed, and obviously this is more common in weird cultures. But still, there are some levels of differing autonomy across all cultures, but they kind of this typical understanding that really the key of adolescence is just this firm, autonomy where you're unaffected by other relationships is kind of a weird notion. But kind of in general, kind of speaking, autonomy is increases in autonomy do come with adolescence. And kind of the idea here with authoritative parenting is because the parents are kind of open to kind of explanations and kind of negotiations and kind of this dialogue, this increases a child's decision-making abilities and kind of their independent decision-making abilities and their kind of just cognition just in general, because they're kind of weighing the pros and cons of things. They're involved in the decision-making process, but still with kind of some with support from their parents. Establishing a marriage. First year of marriage, perceptions of the marital relationships are less favorable. Marital satisfaction declines, and most couples are far more satisfied than dissatisfied with their relationships after the honeymoon phase is over. Although couples spend only slightly less time together, more of the time is devoted to getting tasks done and less to having fun or just talking. Couples are most likely to survive when they maintain a high level of positive and supportive interactions. And couples who remain married but were unhappy had relatively poor quality relationships in the beginning of their relationships. So kind of the idea here is that there is a slight dip in marital satisfaction within kind of weird context, I should say. However, most couples are more satisfied than satisfied with their relationships after the honeymoon phase is over. And the couples who the unhappiest couples kind of in general are married couples, I should say, are those who are kind of unhappy prior to their marriage. So kind of unhappiness prior to marriage being a risk factor for unhappiness during your marriage. I wanted to add to the discussion of marriage by bringing in studies on marriages across the world, and specifically, I wanted to talk about marriages in other cultures. So, arranged marriages and love marriages. The idea of marriages being based on romantic love is not universal. Arranged marriages are those arranged by families rather than the couples themselves. Historically, they have made up the majority of marriages worldwide. Arranged marriages have been common in many cultures. The percentage has been dropping recently in many cultures, including in China, India, Japan, Turkey, and among Orthodox Jews. Half of Indian and Pakistani participants reported they would marry someone with desirable qualities even if they were not in love. Less than 5% of Americans, Australians, British, and Latin Americans said that they would. They're common in cultures with strong extended family ties. Powerful feelings of romantic love, such as intense mutual absorption in a couple, could be seen as irrelevant or even disruptive in cultures with large kinship networks, given that these families or feelings might interfere with a person's ability to respect family members' wishes. Some have argued that social pressures from an extended family system keep a relationship together. Without social pressures from the family, romantic love may be more necessary to keep the couples together. So we see that historically across the world, and I should even add in the United States, but I decided not to include studies about that. But this particular notion of marriage for romantic reasons is a very recent phenomenon, and especially kind of through this independent lens, wherein other people are not influencing who you or are less influential on who you should marry, is a very recent kind of historical phenomenon, in terms of history of humanity. And we still see that in particular cultures, the half of individuals being okay, or would indicating that they would marry someone with desirable traits, even if they were in love, with those numbers being far lower in American, British, and Australian, and some Latin American countries. And kind of the idea here, and this kind of ties into previous discussions we've had with cross-cultural literature throughout this course, and specifically the importance of relationships within these kind of collectivist, interdependent cultures. Those relationships play very important roles in their daily lives, and kind of what they feel is their obligations to society. So therefore, you would expect that those relationships also influence their marriages. And the idea here is that, and some have argued that social pressure is what helps keep a relationship together. However, in the absence of that kind of social pressure and more of these weird contexts, these individualistic contexts, wherein I'm chasing kind of my own desires, my own feelings, I'm trying to kind of, hashtag actualize whatever my inner characteristics are, I am not prone to those social pressures at the same levels as individuals within more interdependent cultures. Thus, I need something to kind of bound my relationships together, and what that thing will be is romantic love. In arranged marriages, the marriage is seen as an intersection of two families, not just two individuals. It might make sense for families to be in a better position to make a decision about the likely success of a marriage. Love marriages, on the other hand, consider love a necessity for marriage. More likely in cultures with a nuclear family structures, bound by romantic love in the absence of social pressure from one's extended family. This love serves as a glue that maintains the relationships. So, as I kind of was alluding to early on in the chapter, kind of this quote-unquote nuclear, that is definitely not found across, or not universally found, I should say, across cultures, and definitely not universally found across historical eras. And as stated, because of kind of this collectivist, interdependent culture, individual decisions don't just affect an individual, it affects other people within your in-group. Thus, it kind of makes sense for families to kind of be involved in the decision-making process, in this case, marriage. And in the absence of that social pressure, you need other kind of glue to maintain relationships, in that case, love. Arranged marriages may be puzzling to some, particularly to Westerners, because the concept goes against many Western assumptions about love and marriage. First, people can only love someone that they have chosen for themselves. Second, only the individuals themselves can make the best choice for themselves. And third, a marriage that's not built on love will end in misery and will be unhappy or unsuccessful. Arranged marriages, however, are often quite successful. Love develops over time even if the individual hasn't chosen the partner. They assume that the family will make the best choice for them, and most people in cultures that practice arranged marriages feel that such an arrangement works. Positive correlation between divorce rates and the extent to which a culture emphasizes the importance of love in a marriage, and generally, there is either no or little differences between love marriages and arranged marriages in terms of marital satisfaction or in different cultures. In several societies, men in arranged marriages are more satisfied than women in arranged marriages. Studies find that arranged marriages are at least as happy as love marriages, except for women in China and Japan. Women in Japanese and Chinese arranged marriages were less satisfied than those in love marriages, suggesting that in those cultures, the cost of arranged marriages may be disproportionately borne largely by women. So kind of the idea, kind of going back to those assumptions previously laid out, that love must exist prior kind of to marriage, and the only way that kind of a marriage can work is through kind of built on love. But this is not universally found, with kind of love developing in kind of most arranged marriages, and couples arranged marriages reporting just about as being as happy as love marriages. However, there are some cultures, as stated, some studies have found that women in Japan and China reporting lower levels of satisfaction within their marriages than men. But this is kind of like not a universal phenomenon, so kind of the point here is kind of those automatic universal assumptions about love are not universally found across cultures. A comparison of marital satisfaction comparing love in arranged marriages indicates that, for both men and women, those in love marriages initially scored higher in marital satisfaction than those in arranged marriages. Trend reverses as time goes on. Most arranged marriages end up becoming loving relationships, even if they begin without love. Couples in arranged and love marriages have different starting points in their levels of mutual love. So looking back after many years of marriage, it might make sense that those in love marriages, which started out extremely high in romantic love, might love less intensely than when they started out. For those in arranged marriages who are likely started out with a lower amount of love might have more love for their partner now than that they have spent time together. People in these two types of marriages have different standards of comparison. So kind of what we have here, a particular study looked at marital satisfaction across time, and they found that love satisfaction was higher in love marriages than arranged marriages, but over time, the trend reverse, wherein arranged marriages report higher levels of marital satisfaction, and this can be due to many reasons. And one proposed reason is listed here is kind of just the idea that you start off with such high level of love, and then through time, that decreases. And that kind of intense feeling of love, and therefore you have kind of a different starting comparison point because arranged marriages in general having less kind of lower, I should say, amounts of love compared to love-based romantic relationships. But then as time goes on, those individuals in arranged marriages kind of in general, the results of this study found that that love satisfaction increasing, and because you have that initial kind of starting point of differences in the initial level of love, that can contribute to kind of different evaluations of kind of the trajectory of your marriage. And namely, they have two types of these two types of marriages contributing to different standards of comparisons. So it may kind of be partially some bias in kind of the measurement of marital satisfaction, but kind of just in general, the idea here is that in love and arranged marriages in this study having similar levels of love as of love-based relationships in this study. But of course, as kind of stated in the previous slide, there are shifts, culture shift over time, and kind of in general in the world, you kind of see a greater increases in the levels of independence, which may affect kind of that trajectory of marital satisfaction over time, but we don't know. Jetting back into topics from the book, kind of weird settings. New Parenthood, by age 40 in 2012, 85% of women have given birth to a child, 76% of men have fathered a child. Parents who cope adaptively have an easy baby, have good problem solving and communication skills, good mental health, find adaptive ways to restructure their lives to accommodate a baby, set realistic expectations for parenthood, and receive reliable support from their parents. So the most parents who cope adaptively have higher levels of social resources, have higher levels of mental health, have better problem-solving skills, and have realistic expectations of what a child is going to bring into their household, and thus they're less likely to be shocked at that if it is crying, for example. So they have realistic expectations, and they approach them with good cognitive skills and family resources and social resources that allow them to adapt to the presence of a new child. New parenthood is a stressful transition. Marital satisfaction typically slightly declines in the first year after your baby is born and continues to decline. Spillover effects from work stress on family life or vice versa. Claims energies from marital relationships can disproportionately harm mothers' sense of mastery/self-esteem. Fathers often become more involved in childcare when a second child is born. Most mothers work outside the home. Half or more of both moms and dads are in dual career families, say they find it difficult to balance work and family, and parents emphasize the positives about parenthood, feel it has contributed a great deal to their personal development. So kind of this idea is that yes, bringing a child into a family is stressful and it can contribute to declines in marital satisfaction. However, parents, when asked about it, typically say that it was worth it and they feel that it contributed to their own personal development. And as stated, the majority of households have dual career families, and that can contribute to difficulties and trying to balance between work, family, raising a child, and maintaining your marriage. And those kind of stressors can spill over into different parts of your life, into your job, and just vice versa. And because mothers traditionally, and still do disproportionately, take on more responsibilities of child raising, this can decrease their self-esteem and or sense of mastery, because it's a child, and the child it's a kind of a long developmental trajectory for a child, and that can kind of at times feel repetitive and semi-hopeless, or where I can't stop this child from crying, and I feel kind of bad about myself. I'm unable to master or improve my parenting, and this kind of sense of discouragement can have potentially disruptions to a mother's sense of self-esteem. The empty nest. Parents react more positively than negatively to children leaving home. Fewer roles and responsibilities. There are less strain and stress, and more opportunity to focus on their marital relationships and evidence they have done their job as parents. So kind of this classic idea of the empty nest. This idea was that once the child leaves, parents, but in particular mothers, obviously, are going to feel at lost and react negatively because now they've lost their duty, their responsibility, and again, their responsibility is being a mother and having household responsibilities. So kind of like this is a very nuclear family, like implicitly / kind of explicitly sexist kind of understanding that in the absence of this parenting responsibilities, mothers would kind of just lose their mind. But research has found that that's not the true, not true, and the fewer responsibilities and the United States contributes to, and mothers view it as an opportunity to improve their marital relationships, and kind of just evidence overall that the parents have done a good job, and thus the child can leave, and I don't have to take care of them anymore, at least as much on a daily basis. Boomerang kids. I want to introduce you to this concept. Young adults who are returning after having lived independently outside the home. Many of the same financial reasons that are influencing young people's decisions to delay exit from the home of their parents are underlying their decisions to return home. Financial reasons and emotional distress, such as mental health issues, contribute. First time in modern times within the United States that living with parents has become the most common living arrangement for 18 to 34-year-olds in the U.S. In 1960, only about 20% of Americans aged 18 to 34 lived with parents, whereas 62% lived with a spouse or partner. Now, 32% live with parents and 32% live with a spouse or partner. Over 40% of Canadians and Europeans in this age range live with their parents, so the United States may only be catching up to the rest of the Western world. Children who return are more likely to have had good relationships with their parents growing up, so there may be less stress between parents and their adult child who return. Parents of young adults who have moved back home because of economic reasons report that they are just as satisfied with their lives as are parents whose adult children are still living independently. So kind of the idea here is we have this empty nest thing. We just said, okay, yeah, that's not really true, but one of the reasons why is like it's proof that you did a good job parenting. But now in this historical era, and we see a trend, again, kind of a shift in kind of family dynamics in the United States of these boomerang kids, wherein they leave, but then they return. So how would that impact that understanding that you did a great job? Well, research has found that that there's little to no reported differences in the level of satisfaction or views of your parenting based on the child coming back home, and a lot of this is because a lot of this is out of their control. So again, these kind of shifts in economics, politics, contributing to wealth stagnation, income stagnation, less opportunities, higher student loan debt, contributing to this is a lot of money, and I really don't have the independent means to just go out and just get a job and make $80,000, whatever it is, like it was in 1950s, 1960s, in a completely different economy. Therefore, children are coming back home at higher rates in the United States, but it's also kind of more in line with trends in other Western European and Canadian in Canada. So it could be that the United States is kind of just now catching up or leveling off at the same levels as other their Western counterparts. But some of the reasons associated with this are stated financial reasons and emotional stress and mental health reasons. So kind of you can imagine COVID, being alone, being isolated, being emotionally distressed, contributing to the likelihood of you returning home, and you being more likely to return home if you have a good relationship with your parents. And quickly looking at this chart, young adults in the U.S. live with parents at highest rates since the Great Depression. This is only in 2014, I should say, and this trend has continued. So kind of, again, you can see parallels between previous shifts in the economy in that case of the Great Depression, and current shifts of the economy contributing to differences in the dynamics of a family. There are three major styles of grandparenting: remote, geographically and emotionally distant; companionate, most common style, see grandchildren frequently, enjoy activities with them; involved, often help with childcare, give advice, and play other practical roles in their grandchildren's lives. Grandparents contribute greatly to grandchildren's development and can mentor young single parents. A close grandparent-grandchild relationship can protect child of a depressed parent from becoming depressed. And children raised by a single mother and grandparents resemble children raised by two parents. So kind of a few interesting points here, and that's we have different family dynamics wherein a single mother, for example, and a grandparent raising a child, and research has found that these developmental outcomes resemble children raised by two parents, suggesting that it's obviously a possibly, an appropriate ways for caregiving that can produce positive outcomes. As stated across many cultures, it's not this kind of nuclear family dynamics of parenting. So obviously there are different ways of parents that can contribute to positive child outcomes. And also, interestingly, grandparents can play a protective role, kind of buffer the impacts of certain stressors within a parent's child household. So particularly, a grandparent can mentor a child as a parent, but also they can protect a child from some of the worst developmental outcomes associated with a depressed parent, for example. So by taking on more of a parenting load, thus kind of exposing the child less to the depressive symptoms associated with depression, but also protecting parents from depression. So by kind of lessening the burden on them. So serving a protective factor, serving as a protective factor for both parents and children. Cultural variation in gendered aging. Women experience more fear, anxiety, and concern about their identity as they age and may feel pressure to prove themselves as productive and valuable members of society. Attitudes about aging vary by race, culture, and sexual orientation. In some cultures, aging women gain greater social status. Asian women they attain greater respect and have greater authority in the household. Compared to white women, black and Latina women possess less stereotypes about aging. And lesbians are more positive about aging and looking older than heterosexual women. So this is kind of just trying to tie it to grandparenting, wherein the understanding of aging and kind of the role of grandparents differ by culture, wherein Asian women, kind of just broadly speaking in general, East Asian women attaining greater respect and greater authority in the household with age, and kind of contributing to kind of parenting, Black and Latino women possessing less stereotypes about aging, and also lesbians having more positive views about aging than heterosexual women. Skipping ahead, sibling relationships. Typically the longest lasting relationships often become warmer and more equal in adulthood, and they often grow even closer in old age. Siblings who enjoy a close relationship during childhood are likely to be drawn closer after significant life events such as parental death. Siblings who had a poor relationship growing up may clash in response to the same event, fight over inheritance. So in general, siblings growing closer with age, and traumatic events bringing them even more closer together. However, in sibling relationships that were already rocky, when kind of a traumatic event happens, they are more at risk to kind of clash in response to a traumatic event, and one example of that is fighting over inheritance. Middle generation squeeze. Situation of middle-aged adults pressured by demands from both the younger and older generations simultaneously. 33% of women aged 55 to 69 report caring for both older and younger generations. Daughters provide more emotional support. Sons about as involved in providing help with practical tasks and financial assistance. Caregiver burden. Psychological distress with the demands of providing care for someone with physical or cognitive impairments. Do not want to help or help out of duty. Lack personal resources, lack social and cultural support for caregiving. Cultural norms affect stress associated with caregiving for older adults. So middle generation squeeze, what's basically what we're getting at here is that as during the last 100 years, overall life expectancy has gone up. And this has created, obviously, a lot more older adults. So now we have a dynamic where individuals around 55 years old still having their parents alive, but also still having children. So they're in this middle generation wherein they have responsibilities for both their parents and their children, but obviously different responsibilities for both. And caregiver burden, just the idea that that in the absence of personal resources, financial resources, social resources, a lack of cultural support can contribute to kind of psychological distress that negatively impacts the caregiver during this kind of middle generational squeeze. However, the stress associated with these caregiving responsibilities differ by culture. Skipping ahead, childlessness does not diminish the well-being of adults. It's sometimes boosted. Marital satisfaction is higher than couples with children during child-rearing years. However, children do not guarantee happiness, and not having children does not mean unhappiness. Dual career families as adults. Working parents experience spillover effects, ways in which events at home affect home life, and events at home carry over into the workplace. Parents' stressful day at work contributes to being withdrawn from your spouse and children after work. There is no indication that mothers working has damaging effect on development, but it's important to keep in mind that the U.S. has no national policy of paid family leave. Why does that matter? Because if you have an opportunity to interact with your child, and you kind of just have less stress associated with needing to provide income, earn income, while also having new caregiving responsibilities can increase stress on parenting and contribute to at least short-term negative developmental outcomes in their offspring. But in general, working parents experience, as I stated, these spillover effects, and we've talked about this throughout class. You don't exist in a vacuum, and all your social dynamics that you have at your workplace, at other relationships, come back home. And if you have individuals who have a particularly stressful work day, or I should say chronic stress at work, contributing to negative kind of relationship dynamics between their spouse and within the married couple, I should say, and among their children, or between the parent and the child. So that's spillover effects. Gay and lesbian families. Gay and lesbian relationships evolve through the same stages of development as heterosexual couples. The relationships are usually egalitarian. Parents share responsibilities equally and tend to work out a division of labor based on who is talented at and does not mind doing a certain task. Lesbian mothers are similar to heterosexual mothers. Children have similar developmental outcomes. Children are no more likely to develop homosexual or bisexual orientation. Their legal barriers can make parenting challenging. A study found that well-being of children was associated with the social climate of the area in which the family lived was supportive of sexual minorities. And I'm just kind of a little straightforward, especially if you're kind of living this out. But kind of what this is alluding to is that if you live in a place that obviously if your family or if your neighbors hate you, if there's legislation that kind of disenfranchises you, that obviously will contribute to your well-being as a parent and also contribute to the well-being of your child, because we have these kind of spillover effects. And obviously those differences in legislation vary by state, but even it was very recently that gay marriage even became legal, and even more recently that some of the legal barriers that exist for gay and lesbian couples to receive their assets, the assets of a deceased spouse following their marriage. So, for example, if you've lived in a state that gay marriage wasn't legal, and then your partner dies, then there was a legal barrier for you to kind of receiving the assets or whatever, receiving the inheritance or whatever whatever was left behind from your partner, just kind of due to those legal barriers. And kind of just the point here is that this is still a very much evolving social dynamic and evolving social climate, which in return impacts obviously the outcomes associated with these couples. Divorcing families. Couples at highest risk for divorce are younger, 20s and 30s. They're married for an average of about only 7 years, have young children, and are poor. These risk factors combine with an unusually high amount of financial and psychological stress, accompanied by new parenthood stress. These couples feel their marriages lack communication, emotional fulfillment, and compatibility. So kind of just this combination of having young children, being poor, having less resources, having not just financial stress, but psychological stress, kind of stress from your marriage, and also new parent stress, just kind of combining and putting you at higher risk for divorce. Divorce is typically a 1 to 2 year crisis. Divorced adults are at higher risk for depression, psychological distress, and physical health problems. Factors that facilitate a positive adjustment to divorce: adequate financial support, good parenting by custodial parent, good parenting by non-custodial parent, minimal conflict between parents, additional social support, minimum other changes in personal resources. So obviously, there are there can be positive adjustments associated with divorce, and this is contributed by kind of the classic things that we understand here: that less conflict between the divorced parents, minimal conflict between parents, having resources, social and financial resources, and just having social support kind of in general, facilitating and contributing to greater likelihood of having a positive adjustment following divorce. Reconstituted families. Within 3 to 5 years after a divorce, 75% of single-parent families acquire a step-parent. About 60% of remarried couples divorce. Recurring cycles of singlehood, cohabitation of marriage, conflict, and separation of divorce. 1/3 of adults find remarriage more stressful than divorce. So kind of basically a majority of divorced couples becoming remarried within 5 years, and then a majority of those becoming divorced. And about a third of individuals reporting that the remarriages was more stressful than their divorce. Wrapping up with child abuse. Why does child abuse occur? Child abuse is defined as mistreating or harming a child physically, emotionally, or sexually. It is the most visible form of family violence. Child maltreatment is a broad term that includes both child abuse and neglect on the child's basic needs. 75% of abused children are neglected, 16% are physically abused, 9% are sexually abused, and 7% are emotionally or psychologically abused. So you can see that the majority of abused children are neglected, and then the least abused, and this is reported. Obviously, these numbers are in kind of the same kind of caveats apply to all kind of these numbers, wherein many people who are abused don't report them, but kind of this is kind of just an estimate. With, as stated, the majority of abused children being neglected, but also other forms of abuse taking place. Child abusers disproportionately tend to have been abused as children. 30% of parents who are abused their children. Intergenerational transmission of parenting. Passing down from generation to generation of parenting styles, whether abusive or positive parenting. Stress of being abused could alter expression of genes that affect parenting and make for an overreactive stress response system later in life. Abusive mothers are often abused by their partners. So it's important to note that obviously not all child abusers, or not all people who are abused are going to abuse their children, but it does put them at higher risk of doing so. And kind of the idea through this intergenerational transmission of parenting is that maybe kind of through this series of epigenetics contributing to, or I should say, this series of genetic expression from environmental stressors impacting or through the process of epigenetics, which we talked about, contributing to kind of parenting style. So maybe aggressive behavior or non-responsive or over-responsiveness due to an overreactive or underreactive stress response system. And mothers who are abusive are often abused by their partners themselves. So kind of this entire like household of abuse taking place and kind of reinforcing each other. The abusive parent. Abusers often have mental health problems. However, it's important to note that only 1 in 10 have a severe psychological disorder. Abusers find themselves powerless as parents. Normal challenges of parenting stressful and threatening. Abusive parents often have distorted perceptions of normal behavior of infants and young children. When infants cry, an abusive parent may infer that the baby is rejecting them and talking back. So kind of the idea here is that although severe mental psychological disorder places an individual at risk of child abuse, the supermajority of people who have severe psychological disorders do not abuse their children. Again, these are kind of just like risk factors, not majority, not even close. It's really a super minority. And then kind of the idea here with the final bullet points is that because these parents may feel powerless and maybe possibly abuse themselves and have a kind of a dysfunctional or kind of a stress responsive system that was adaptive given their context of growing up, they may have higher likelihoods of kind of having this hostile attribution bias wherein they interpret the behaviors of their infants, such as crying, kind of as rejecting them or talking back to them, or some kind of direct challenge to their authority, but or really just kind of their quality or their credibility as a parent. So thus the infant's talking directly to them, at them, and thus they kind of see it's a challenge, and therefore they could place them at higher likelihood of abusing their child. Abuse is most likely to occur when a parent is under great stress and has little social support. Life changes such as the loss of a job or move can disrupt family functioning and contribute to abuse or neglect. Macro-environmental factors. Child abuse is less common in societies that discourage or outlaw physical punishment of children. So we have these macro and kind of micro and kind of neighborhood as well factors contributing to the likelihood of abusing a child, or and as we stated before, kind of neglect is kind of the most common form of child mistreatment. So maybe a parent gets depressed following a job loss, or kind of just a loss of identity now that they've lost their job. Maybe they become start abusing substances, become an addict, and then they are or depressed at the same time. So then they're kind of distant, they're neglectful to a child, and then kind of maltreatment can occur through this kind of neglect. Impacts of child abuse. Abuse and maltreated children have developmental problems across multiple domains: health, physical, atypical brain development, cognitive deficits, behavioral problems, and psychological disorders. Can negatively impact a child's developing brain, the stress response system, and other biological systems which affect psychological functioning. Academic and cognitive difficulties are common. Their marriages are more negative and less satisfying, and their relationships with their families are less close. So kind of just the impacts of child abuse can be found across multiple domains and contribute to poor relationships, not just between their parents, but also their future relationships as well. How do we stop the violence? Teach positive parenting skills to parents who use harsh parenting techniques. Comprehensive ecological approach designed to convert a pathological family system into a healthy one, and address poverty / the roots of stresses to stop the intergenerational transmission of abuse. That's all for this week. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next week. And have a great week. Bye.